By the end of August 1942, the waters off Guadalcanal had become a graveyard. The men who fought there called it Iron Bottom Sound, though the name came later, after too many ships had gone down to count. Beneath that narrow stretch of ocean between Guadalcanal, Savo, and Flora Islands lay the twisted wreckage of cruisers, destroyers, and transports, American, Japanese, and Australian alike, silent monuments to nights that belonged to the enemy. The Japanese Navy ruled those nights. From their strongholds at Rabaul and the Shortlands, they ran the Tokyo Express, sleek destroyers that thundered down the slot under cover of darkness. They moved with the precision of a subway timetable, delivering troops, ammunition, and rice to the starving garrisons clinging to the northern jungles of Guadalcanal. When daylight came, they vanished, leaving behind the mangled hulks of any Allied ship that had dared to intercept them. The U.S. Navy could not match them after sunset. American radar was still crude, its operators green, its coverage patchy at best. Gun crews strained their eyes against the horizon, but the Japanese were masters of night tactics, firing by star shell and instinct, guided by years of training in nocturnal maneuver. The Marines ashore at Henderson Field watched the horizon glow red and heard the thunder of unseen guns echoing through the humid dark. To them, the night was not rest. It was terror. Admiral Reizo Tanaka commanded the Tokyo Express with a gambler's coolness. His destroyers, like Amajiri and Fubuki, cut through the Black Seas at 30 knots, their decks awash in phosphorescent spray. He knew the Americans could not stop him, not yet. Each night his ships delivered food and shells to the troops of the 17th Army, then withdrew before dawn. The Allied airmen could attack only when the sun rose. At night, the ocean belonged to Japan. But on Henderson Field, the U.S. forces were desperate. Their ammunition stocks dwindled, their rations thin, their wounded growing in number. Every shell the Japanese landed at night meant another Marine dead in the morning. The Navy needed eyes that could pierce the dark, track the destroyers, and warn the island before the shelling began. In early September, the call went out from Espiritu Santo. Patrol Wing 11 was to send its consolidated PBY Catalinas north to Guadalcanal. They were ungainly aircraft, slow, lumbering flying boats with broad wings and a crew of 10. In daylight patrols, they were known as Dumbo for their size and Catalina for their endurance. No one imagined they would soon become the terror of the night. Their first missions were reconnaissance. Lieutenant William Busford of VP-23 described the sea as a black sheet of glass, streaked with fire when ships fought. His crew flew 15-hour sorties, searching for wakes or shadows that betrayed Japanese movements. They had no radar, no flares bright enough to light a convoy. Often, they returned with nothing but exhaustion, and yet, on one September night, Ford's navigator sighted the phosphorescent churn of propellers east of Savo Island. It was the first confirmed tracking of a Tokyo Express run by air. The Catalina followed from high above, silent, its engines throttled back until the aircraft trembled. Below, the Japanese ships moved like knives through silk. Ford's radioman tapped out the contact report, his voice shaking. Henderson Field scrambled its few operational bombers, but by the time they arrived, the destroyers had vanished. The sea was empty again. Still, that one night marked a beginning. For the first time, the Americans had seen their enemy in his element. The idea took root: if they could see him, perhaps one day they could strike him. When dawn broke over Iron Bottom Sound, the air was thick with smoke and humidity. The surface shimmered like oil, hiding the hulks beneath. Somewhere out there, a new kind of war was stirring, a war fought not by day, but in the blind hours between dusk and dawn. The Catalinas, awkward and slow, would become its unlikely hunters. And in the dark waters off Guadalcanal, the balance was beginning, barely, invisibly, to shift. By October 1942, the men who flew the Catalinas had learned what it meant to live in darkness. They launched before dusk and returned after dawn, salt-caked and hollow-eyed, their skin burned by engine heat and salt spray. At Espiritu Santo, they joked bitterly that theirs was the loneliest war, 10 men and a flying boat suspended over 1,000 miles of black water. The truth was, the loneliness was killing them faster than the Japanese ever could. The PBY Catalina was a paradox, ungainly yet elegant, fragile yet enduring. Its wings span 104 feet, and its twin Pratt & Whitney R1830 engines could drone on for 20 hours without rest. The plane carried bombs and depth charges, but its greatest weapon was endurance. The pilots called it a truck with wings, but even they admitted, when the lights of the base finally appeared on the horizon, that no machine had ever felt more alive. By late 1942, Navy patrol squadrons VP-11, VP-23, and VP-54 had begun experimenting with night reconnaissance. Some aircraft had been equipped with the British-designed ASV Mark II radar, a crude, flickering device with a cathode screen that painted enemy ships as ghostly blips. The equipment was primitive and temperamental, one spark of tropical moisture could short it out. Still, it was better than blindness. Lieutenant William B. Bus Ford, whose crew had been the first to shadow a Tokyo Express convoy, described the feeling in his mission log. "You don't fly at night out here. You swim through it. The sea and sky are one black sheet. Sometimes the stars vanish and you feel as if you're flying through ink." The Catalinas had no interior lighting save for a dim red lamp. The men spoke in whispers to avoid breaking concentration. The navigator would crouch over his table, compass trembling with each vibration, marking bearings on a damp chart. The radar operator, often the youngest aboard, watched his screen with eyes half closed, praying that the next signal wasn't just static. When contact came, it was never gradual. A single green spike appeared on the radar scope, then another, then a cluster. Somewhere below, unseen ships moved through the night. The pilot would cut power, and the big flying boat would sink lower, skimming the waves, its shadow lost against the sea. The radio man would begin tapping out the contact report to Henderson Field, multiple destroyers, bearing 040, speed 30 knots, course southeast. Below them, the Japanese destroyers of the 8th Fleet surged southward, their decks crowded with supplies. Admiral Reizo Tanaka still commanded the nightly runs, his ships running blacked out, every light extinguished. Lookouts stood at the bow, eyes straining for silhouettes against the faint starlight. To them, the Catalina was a ghost. Sometimes they heard it before they saw it, a distant, uneven hum that vanished as quickly as it came. In the Japanese 4th Air Group War Diary, one officer wrote on November 9, 1942, "Enemy reconnaissance planes have begun to appear even in darkness. We hear their engines but cannot see them. It is like being hunted by the wind." The Americans were learning too. Each mission brought a new lesson: what altitude kept them invisible to radar, what engine settings reduced their signature, how close they could approach before the Japanese opened fire. The Catalinas were not armed for dogfights, but they carried 500-pound bombs and depth charges. Sometimes, when fortune favored them, a pilot would roll into a shallow dive and release his load on a glimmering wake. More often, they watched the bombs fall wide and detonated harmlessly in the sea, the light briefly illuminating the faces of men below. Back at Espiritu Santo, crews began painting the undersides of their Catalinas matte black, dulling the glare of moonlight on aluminum. They covered instrument panels with red filters and taped their watches to prevent reflection. It was not yet doctrine, it was improvisation born of exhaustion and necessity. By December, they had begun to call themselves the Black Cats. The name started as a joke scrawled on a mess tent wall. But it would soon become something far more serious. For now, though, they were still learning to see in the black. Every night was an experiment, every mission a test of nerves. They were not yet hunters, only watchers. But as the nights grew longer and the enemy's runs more desperate, the Catalina's shadow over the sea deepened, and with it, the first true challenge to Japan's mastery of the dark. By January 1943, the transformation was complete. What had begun as a handful of tired patrol crews improvising survival tactics had hardened into an organized system of nocturnal warfare. The Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics, slow to grasp what its own pilots were discovering, began issuing directives referring formally to Black Cat operations. It was an unofficial name made official by results. The men of VP-12, VP-54, and VP-71 painted their Catalinas entirely matte black, from wingtip to tail. The blue-gray naval roundels were overpainted in dark blue, visible only up close. Even the big twin engines were coated in soot-mixed lacquer to reduce reflection. Mechanics worked by flashlight, their tools wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound. The Catalinas that had once been daylight patrol craft now became shadows that lived on moonless nights. The idea had come from necessity. The Tokyo Express was still running strong, Tanaka's destroyers flashing through the slot at 30 knots, bringing men and supplies to Guadalcanal and extracting the wounded. Surface engagements were frequent but inconclusive. The U.S. Navy's daylight bombers couldn't catch the convoys. By night, radar was unreliable. The Black Cats filled that void, combining reconnaissance, attack, and harassment in one mission. Their base at Tulagi was a narrow strip of crushed coral and palm stumps. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with brine. Catalinas floated offshore, tethered to buoys, rocking gently in the warm surf. Crews slept in tents or on the wings of their planes, resting through the oppressive tropical days. They lived for the hours between dusk and dawn. Mission briefings were simple: patrol the slot, intercept enemy traffic, report movements, engage if possible. The crews carried 500-pound bombs under each wing, for 0.50 caliber machine guns, and, where available, a small supply of parachute flares. A full fuel load meant they could stay aloft for 18 hours. Each sortie was a test of human endurance. On the night of January 10, 1943, Lieutenant Commander Clarence Taft's crew from VP-12 scored the first confirmed sinking of a Japanese destroyer by a Black Cat. His Catalina shadowed a convoy near Vela Gulf for nearly an hour before releasing flares and dropping 2 500-pounders amid the cluster of wakes. One bomb struck a ship identified post-war as the Nagara-class destroyer Kuroshio. Japanese records confirm the ship was heavily damaged and later scuttled. It was the first time radar, flares, and night bombing had combined to destroy a fast-moving warship. The impact was immediate. Within weeks, the Japanese began deploying more anti-aircraft guns on their transports and destroyers. Searchlights swept the sea when engines were heard, and small-caliber tracers laced the night. But the Catalinas were elusive. They attacked from low altitude, black silhouettes invisible against the sea until the last second. Lieutenant Ralph Baker of VP-71 recalled, "When you came down on a convoy, it was like diving into a bonfire. Every ship opened up. You could feel the plane shudder from the concussion, and the whole ocean lit up like a fairground. But if you stayed low and fast, you could be gone before they found you again." The Japanese 4th Air Group War Diary began recording nightly enemy harassment raids by twin-engine flying boats. The tone shifted from irritation to alarm. Pilots complained that the Americans seemed to find them anywhere. One officer wrote bitterly, "The enemy's sea ghosts return each night, dropping fire from darkness." By February, the results were measurable. According to 13 fighter command reports and naval records, Black Cats operating from Tulagi and Espiritu Santo had flown 386 sorties in 30 days, sinking or damaging 16 enemy vessels and spotting over 50 convoys. Their intelligence reports allowed American PT boats and destroyers to intercept Japanese runs more effectively, turning the once invincible Tokyo Express into a nightly gauntlet. For the crews, the work remained grueling. Missions stretched to the limits of both machine and man. When they returned, their faces were streaked with exhaust soot, their hands raw from cold and vibration. Yet the morale was high. They knew they were changing the balance of the campaign. At dawn, the Catalinas would glide down through the mist, landing gently on the glassy sea. The ground crew would wait out to meet them, helping tie up the plane to the buoy. The engines ticked as they cooled, and the smell of salt water and burned fuel filled the air. Above them, the sun rose over Guadalcanal, and the men who had ruled the night staggered ashore to sleep. By March 1943, Black Cat had ceased to be just a nickname. It was a badge of identity, painted on the fuselage in dark silhouettes of prowling felines. It symbolized what the men had become, hunters in the dark, silent and unseen, prowling through enemy waters that once belonged only to the rising sun. By March 1943, the Imperial Japanese Navy had learned to fear the night. What had once been their cloak, darkness, was now turned against them. Admiral Tanaka, still commanding elements of the Tokyo Express, had adapted by dispatching smaller convoys under heavier escort. The destroyers steamed in tight formation, their decks bristling with machine guns and light cannon. Cargo barges hugged their wakes, low to the water and hard to detect by radar. These were called the Teishinsen, the Iron Convoys, and their mission was to feed the starving garrisons scattered across the Solomon chain. On the night of March 16, 1943, one such convoy departed Rabaul under radio silence. The log of the Japanese 4th Air Group recorded that it consisted of 2 destroyers, Suzukes and Arisher, escorting 4 transports and a cluster of smaller barges bound for Vila, on Kalimanjaro. The sea was calm, the moon a narrow crescent. Their commander believed he had chosen a perfect night. Far to the south, in Tulagi Lagoon, the crews of VP-54 were preparing their Catalinas for another patrol. The maintenance men had just finished repainting the hull of PBY-5A Black Magic, flown by Lieutenant Jack Campbell, whose crew had already gained a reputation for recklessness. Their plane was a patchwork of bullet holes and quick repairs, the black paint dulled by salt and heat. But its radar, an experimental ASV Mark II set, was among the most reliable in the theater. At 2,200 hours, Black Magic lifted from the water, the sound of her twin Pratt & Whitneys swallowed by the wind. The crew settled into the long silence of the patrol. The only light came from the red glow of the instrument dials. They flew low, just 300 feet above the waves, using the horizon to mask their outline from enemy lookouts. At 0135, the radar operator, Ensign Robert Red Haskins, reported a faint contact, a cluster of moving returns bearing 320 degrees, distance 28 miles. The pattern was unmistakable, ships in formation. Campbell adjusted course and climbed to 1,000 feet, calling in the contact to 13 Fighter Command. He received the terse acknowledgement he expected: proceed with illumination and attack. At 0152, they sighted the wakes, thin silver ribbons under the moon. Campbell gave the order, flares. 2 parachute flares drifted down, igniting the sea below in ghostly daylight. The black convoy was caught in an instant tableau: white hulls, gun flashes, chaos. The Black Magic roared in low, releasing 2 500-pound bombs in quick succession. One struck a transport amidships, the other fell close to a destroyer's stern. Explosions rippled across the water. Japanese accounts described the attack with stunned disbelief. The Suzuki's captain wrote in his log, "Enemy flying boat appeared suddenly from darkness, dropped fire as though from the moon itself. One ship burning, another damaged. Impossible to pursue." The convoy scattered, their guns raking the night sky in blind fury. Campbell circled once more, lining up for a strafing run. The Catalina's forward turret opened fire, the tracers stitching across a transport's deck. The radio crackled with warning: Japanese float planes scrambling from Vila. The crew doused their lights and dropped altitude, skimming the waves toward the south. Tracers whipped overhead. They were ghosts again. At 0310, they rendezvoused with another Black Cat, PBY-5A Midnight Mistress, flown by Lieutenant J.G. Roy Jenkins. The 2 crews coordinated silently by radio flashes, shadowing what remained of the convoy until dawn. When the sun rose, all that was left of the Iron Convoy were slicks of oil and scattered debris drifting north with the tide. The next day, 13 Fighter Command logged the report as confirmed destruction: 1 large transport, 1 probable destroyer, 2 barges damaged. The Japanese 4th Air Group's diary matched the losses exactly: 2 ships sunk, 1 crippled. When the crews returned to Tulagi, their uniforms were stiff with salt and sweat. The mechanics waded into the surf to pull the Catalina ashore. The men didn't cheer, they just smiled wearily, lit cigarettes, and stared toward the horizon. In their exhaustion there was pride. That night, the Japanese convoy routes shifted farther north, forcing them into longer, more perilous runs. The Black Cats had reshaped the map of the Solomon Sea, not by daylight battles or grand fleets, but by the quiet, relentless work of men who hunted in darkness. By late April 1943, the Black Cats had become both hunters and legends. The Japanese called them Yuri-Hikoki, ghost planes. Convoys whispered their name before departing Rabaul, and nervous gunners fired at clouds when the moon broke through. But with each success, the danger grew. The Imperial Navy had learned to adapt. Searchlights now swept the sea with mechanical precision, and radar-equipped night fighters from the 204th Air Group began prowling the same skies the Catalinas had once owned alone. For the men of VP-12, that reality came crashing down on the night of April 22, 1943. The mission was routine on paper: patrol the slot, observe traffic bound for Colombangara, and attack if feasible. Lieutenant Charles Chuck Bowden's crew took off from Tulagi at 2100, flying Catalina PBY-5A Dark Eyes. It was their 19th sortie in 30 days. The men were tired, their faces drawn, but the ritual was always the same: rub black grease under the eyes, check the fuel, check the guns, then slip into the dark. The radar picked up contact at 2320, multiple ships moving fast, 30 miles northwest of Colombangara. Bowden ordered flares ready. His co-pilot, Ensign Tom Eberly, muttered, "Feels too quiet tonight." The Catalina banked gently into its attack run. The first flare dropped perfectly, blooming into white light that bathed the sea in radiance. Below, 3 destroyers were visible, escorting a trio of transports. The Japanese gunners reacted instantly. Searchlights blazed upward, cutting beams across the sky like prison bars. Tracers streaked past the cockpit in burning arcs. "Bombs away," shouted Bowden. 2 500-pounders fell clean, exploding alongside the lead transport. Flames leapt skyward. But in the glare, the Catalina was a clear silhouette. The destroyer's guns found their range. The first hit tore through the port wing. Fuel gushed into the air, igniting into a streaming trail of fire. "Fire in the port tank!" "Feather two!" Eberly yelled, fighting the controls as the Catalina lurched. The men in the waist compartment scrambled to jettison loose gear, anything to keep the plane aloft. The radio operator sent a brief, clipped signal: "Under attack, taking fire." Near Colombangara. It would be their last transmission. Japanese records, recovered after the war from the Arashi's logbook, confirmed the scene: enemy flying boat aflame. Crashed on sea. Wreckage burned. The destroyer launched shells into the debris until the flames sank beneath the waves. Back at Tulagi, Bowden's squadron waited through the night. When dawn broke, and the Catalina failed to return, the crewmen stood silently on the coral shore. It was a ritual they knew too well: no speeches, no ceremony. The sea took its own. The loss hit hard, but it didn't stop operations. That same night, Lieutenant Roy Jenkins of VP-54 volunteered to fly the same route. "We'll find them," he said simply. His crew took off under low clouds, slipping north into the danger zone. Near dawn, they spotted wreckage floating among oil slicks, sections of a wing, a life raft torn open, and a single black-painted life vest. Jenkins circled once, then turned south for home. The Black Cats buried their dead in makeshift ceremonies. A small wooden cross stood by the lagoon, etched with Bowden's name and those of his crew. Someone painted beneath it in fading white letters: "They ruled the night." In Washington, the Naval Intelligence reports summarized the event with bureaucratic precision: loss of 1 PBY-5A. Crew presumed Kia. Mission objective accomplished. Enemy shipping damaged. But among the men at Tulagi, it was more than an entry in a ledger: it was proof of what the darkness demanded. Still, the missions continued. Replacement crews arrived, young men who'd heard rumors of the Black Cat's exploits and came eager to join. They were trained quickly: navigation by stars, silent approach, and the art of seeing without being seen. By May, the balance of power around Colombangara had subtly shifted. Japanese convoys moved only under overcast skies, their searchlights doused unless absolutely necessary. They had learned fear. The ghosts of Bowden's crew haunted the waters, a silent warning that no night in the Solomon Sea would ever again belong fully to Japan. June 1943 marked a turning point. The battle for the Solomon Islands was becoming a war of attrition fought in the dark. With Guadalcanal secured, Allied attention turned north, toward New Georgia and the chain of islands guarding the approach to Rabaul. Every night, Japanese destroyers darted down the slot to reinforce garrisons at Vila and Munda. They called it the Rat Transportation. To stop it, the U.S. Navy intensified its night operations. PT boats, destroyers, and the Black Cats would now work in concert, coordinating by radio and radar to ambush enemy convoys in narrow island channels. The men of Patrol Squadron 11, VP-11, arrived at Tulagi that month, inheriting the battle-tested methods of the veterans who came before them. They were led by Lieutenant Commander Howard Ady, a quiet officer with 1,200 flying hours in Catalinas. His men called him Old Howard, though he was only 33. On June 25, his squadron received a coded order: increased Japanese traffic expected Kula Gulf region. Night patrols authorized for offensive action. That same evening, Ady briefed his crews on a makeshift table under a tarpaulin. A map of the Solomon Sea was pinned with thumbtacks and string. "They're moving supplies from Bougainville to Vila," he said. "We've got radar support from the destroyers in Kula Gulf. We go in at 0200, flare the area, and drive them into the PT boats waiting in the shallows." The men nodded, sipping tepid coffee, the smell of oil and jungle heavy in the air. At 22:45, PBY 5A Shadow Queen slipped from the lagoon and turned northwest. The water reflected the stars in broken silver patches. Ady sat forward in the cockpit, his eyes fixed on the dim horizon. The Catalinas crew moved in silence. At midnight, radar picked up a faint line of returns, ships moving southeast at 28 knots. The Tokyo Express was on the run again. "Contact confirmed," said Ensign Wells, the radar operator. "3 large, maybe 4 smaller." Ady keyed the radio. "Shadow Queen to Kula Gulf Control, Express inbound, bearing 310. Commencing illumination run." 2 other Catalinas, Black Magic 2 and Night Howl, joined in formation, spaced 3 miles apart. At 0130, the first flare ignited above Kula Gulf, descending like a slow, brilliant comet. The scene that unfolded below was one of sudden, blinding chaos. Japanese destroyers, their decks crowded with crates and troops, opened fire in panic. Anti-aircraft tracers arced skyward, green and red streaks painting the night. "Coming up on target, steady," Ady said. The bombs released cleanly, for thudding concussions echoing across the Gulf. One found its mark, striking a transport identified later as Kokai Maru. The ship erupted in orange flame, her bow shearing apart. Below, American PT boats, PT-157 and PT-159, raced into the confusion, their torpedoes slicing through the illuminated water. Within minutes, 2 more Japanese ships were struck. The entire Gulf was alive with fire. Then the counterattack began. From Vila, Japanese S-6M2N roof float planes, fighters built from 0 frames, rose to intercept. They were crude but fast, and their pilots had trained specifically for hunting Catalinas. "Bandits inbound, port side high," cried the tail gunner. Ady banked sharply, but tracers tore through the wing route. A round shattered the starboard engine cowling. Smoke filled the cockpit. "We've lost oil pressure." Ady ordered the crew to jettison everything non-essential. The Catalina dropped altitude, skimming just above the waves. One roof overshot, diving too steeply and smashing into the sea in a burst of spray. The others broke off, low on fuel. By 0330, Shadow Queen limped back south, her right engine coughing flame. They landed at dawn, the hull scorched and riddled with holes. Mechanics swarmed over her as Ady climbed out, face blackened with oil. "Put her back together," he said simply. "We'll need her tomorrow." The results of the Kula Gulf trap were decisive. U.S. reports confirmed 5 Japanese ships sunk or damaged, with minimal Allied losses. Interrogations of captured Japanese sailors later revealed that the operation shattered the morale of the Rat transport crews. "The black planes found us in every darkness," one survivor recalled. For the Black Cats, the Battle of Kula Gulf proved something greater than tactics. It proved that the night itself could be commanded. What had begun as improvisation was now an art of war. And for the first time, Japan's once dominant nocturnal fleet no longer ruled the dark waters of the Solomon Sea. By July 1943, the Black Cats were no longer an experiment, they were a doctrine. What had started as a desperate adaptation had matured into a precision tool of naval warfare. The Imperial Japanese Navy still prowled the northern Solomons, but its routes had grown erratic and fearful. Every convoy now had to assume the sky above was alive with unseen predators. And they were right. VP-12, VP-54, and VP-71 rotated their patrols in a deadly rhythm, striking at random hours and unpredictable angles. To the Japanese, the Catalinas seemed to appear from nowhere. The flares they dropped were like traps laid by the gods, columns of artificial daylight that revealed entire fleets at once. A Japanese captain later wrote, "We came to dread the light itself." When the sea turned white, death followed. That same month, the Black Cats began working more closely with Marine scout bombers based at Munda and PT boats operating from Rendova. The coordination was rough, improvised by radio and instinct. But it worked. Each branch learned to read the other's rhythm. When the Catalinas illuminated, the PT boats struck. When the destroyers drove the Japanese north, the Cats were there to harry them on retreat. The night of July 21st was one of those operations. Lieutenant Roy Jenkins, veteran of the Iron Convoy attack, flew PBY-5A Midnight Mistress north along the coast of New Georgia. His crew had been in the air for 7 hours when radar caught movement, a large convoy approaching the Blackett Strait, running fast and low. Jenkins' voice came over the intercom, calm and even. "They're trying to run the narrow gap again. Let's make them regret it." The Catalina dropped altitude, following the shape of the islands, blending shadow against shadow. Below, the Japanese convoy threaded the narrow channel between reefs, their wakes faint ribbons in the darkness. At 0150, Jenkins released 3 flares in sequence. The gulf below erupted into silver daylight, exposing the destroyers Amagiri, Matsukes, and several smaller barges. The convoy responded with immediate fury. Searchlights stabbed upward, and every gun that could fire, did. Jenkins held steady, flying directly through the chaos. The bombardier released 2 bombs, one near miss, one direct hit amidships on a transport. The ship exploded in an orange blossom of flame, hurling debris across the sea. "Good hit," shouted the tail gunner, just as the Catalina shuddered. The right engine had taken a shell burst. Oil splattered across the canopy. Jenkins fought the controls, struggling to hold altitude. Below, tracers continued to climb, but the Catalina stayed low and fast. At 0210, the Japanese destroyer Amagiri broke formation to pursue. The same ship, unknown to the Americans, would later collide with PT-109, commanded by Lieutenant John F. Kennedy, just 2 weeks later. That night, she was a hunter. Jenkins' radar operator called out, "Closing from astern, distance 800 yards. Jenkins made a decision. "We'll give them a present." He ordered the remaining 2 bombs armed and swung the Catalina in a wide turn. Coming in from low altitude, they dropped both explosives directly across Amagiri's bow. One detonated in her wake, blowing out her forward searchlight. The second struck close enough to buckle plating. The destroyer slowed, trailing smoke. The Midnight Mistress escaped south, limping on one engine, the crew exhausted but alive. They reached Tulagi at dawn, greeted by men who had listened to the entire engagement through the static of the radio net. The Catalina's hull was pocked with shrapnel, the paint scorched a dull gray. Jenkins, eyes red with fatigue, simply said, "We gave them their own medicine." The post-action reports were clinical: 1 transport sunk, 1 destroyer damaged. No friendly losses. But what could not be written in figures was the slow, psychological toll of those missions. The men began to speak of the night as a living thing, an ally that could turn on them at any moment. For the Japanese, that sense of dread was even worse. Captured diaries from sailors of the 4th Air Group spoke of black-winged demons and fire that falls without sound. They began painting their ships with darker camouflage and ordered lookouts to stare skyward until their eyes burned. The balance of the night war had shifted entirely. The Black Cats, once outnumbered, under-equipped, and improvising survival, were now the masters of the dark. But as the victories mounted, so too did the cost. Machines could be replaced. Men could not. And the darkness, though it hid them, began to feel heavier with each return flight. By September 1943, the Black Cats had hunted across nearly every stretch of the Solomon Sea. Their reputation preceded them. Japanese convoys moved only under storms, hugging coastlines and cutting engines at the first sign of radar. Yet even that was not enough. The Americans were pushing north, and Rabaul, the Japanese bastion on New Britain, was next. The Navy's high command planned to isolate it by sea and air, choking its supply lines. The Black Cats would strike first. The mission brief came on September 17, in the dim-lit operations hut at Espiritu Santo. Lieutenant Commander Howard Ady, the same man who'd led the Kula Gulf ambush, stood over the map. "Tonight, we go farther than we ever have," he said quietly. "We'll patrol the approaches to Rabaul itself. Intelligence reports a convoy leaving Simpson Harbor, bound for Buka. They think they're safe beyond our range. They're not." 2 Catalinas, PBY-5A Shadow Queen and PBY-5A Moonlight Maiden, would fly in tandem. Each carried a full bomb load and extra fuel tanks lashed inside the fuselage, bringing the total endurance to nearly 20 hours. Their route would take them over St. George's Channel, into the teeth of the enemy's strongest defenses. The risk was clear: if anything went wrong, rescue was impossible. They took off at 2,000 hours. The sky was moonless, the air smooth. Below them, the ocean was an invisible void broken only by the white crests of waves. For hours, they flew in silence, broken only by the hum of engines and the creak of the fuselage. At 0145, radar operator Ensign Wells broke the monotony. "Contact bearing 285. Multiple returns, speed 20 knots. Looks like a convoy." Ady leaned forward. "That's them. Prepare for illumination." The first flare fell at 0203. What it revealed was staggering: a full supply convoy escorted by 2 destroyers, steaming northwest in formation. Through binoculars, Ady could see crates lashed to open decks, men scrambling for their guns. He gave the order. "Run in, low and fast." The Shadow Queen descended to 500 feet, lining up her approach. Bomb bay doors opened, and 4 500-pounders fell in sequence. One struck a transport dead center, the explosion blinding even at distance. The second hit near a destroyer's stern, crippling her. The Japanese responded instantly, tracers streaked upward, searchlights sweeping across the clouds. The sky turned white with gunfire. The Moonlight Maiden, piloted by Lieutenant Robert Sloan, came in next, strafing the convoy to cover Ady's withdrawal. Her gunners emptied their belts into the decks below. A burst from a 25mm gun caught her tail, shredding the fabric and sending smoke into the cabin. "We're hit but holding," Sloan reported. "Fins shot to pieces." For 40 minutes, the 2 Catalinas danced through hell, dropping flares, bombs, and machine gun fire until the sea itself seemed to burn. When their ammunition ran dry, Ady ordered the retreat. Both planes turned south, engines roaring, fuel gauges perilously low. At dawn, they reached the open ocean. Sloan's Catalina was trailing smoke, one engine coughed, sputtered, and died. Ady slowed his own craft to stay alongside. Over the radio came Sloan's calm voice: "Tell the boys we lit their harbor, Howard. That's enough for me." Moments later, his plane lost altitude, gliding toward the sea. The crew bailed out, their black figures vanishing into the morning haze. Ady circled until his fuel gauge hovered near empty, but no survivors were found. The after-action report listed the Rabaul strike as tactically successful. 3 enemy ships sunk, 2 heavily damaged. But among the squadrons at Tulagi and Espiritu Santo, the mood was subdued. The Moonlight Maiden and her crew were gone, swallowed by the same darkness they had once ruled. In the weeks that followed, the Japanese ceased running convoys to Rabaul altogether. Their own logs described intolerable enemy air harassment at night. The sea lanes fell silent. The Black Cats had achieved their final victory, not by annihilation, but by fear. When the war ended 2 years later, only fragments of their planes remained, resting in lagoons or buried beneath coral sands. Yet among those who flew them, the memory endured. They had been the Navy's ghosts, the silent eyes of the Pacific. And though their war was fought in shadows, their triumph reshaped the night forever.